Takes a village, thank you. Okay, so last time we were going through nutrients that are critical for prior to pregnancy, and we stopped here at choline, which is actually a good place to stop. So choline's pretty interesting because it is actually not categorized as a nutrient in what you've learned from your intro classes, whereas it's something that you must consume from diet because we can't make it. But choline is something that we can generate, but not very well. So dietary choline affects our ability to have things like acetylcholine and things that it does. So choline, and choline has gotten to be a pretty hot topic with respect to memory and maximizing the most positive thing that you can do with pregnancy and diet. Choline is an important factor. And I have to tell you that when I'm thinking about these things and relaying them to you, I also think how much people in the United States don't know and how much they need education on. Because I bet, there's people that don't know, anything about the country right now, and they certainly don't know how to eat prior to pregnancy. And then when we get into, regularly anybody could say, well, you need fruits and vegetables and fish and this, or probably could describe a good diet, but they don't understand the critical nature of some of these nutrients. In particular, choline is one of those, because it's not an official nutrient, but we still need it. It's because we don't make enough. It's just important. And one of the reasons it's important, and I just found an article, a diagram that just shows you, neurotransmitters, because you've heard of acetylcholine. Have y'all heard of acetylcholine? Yeah, that's a neurotransmitter, which means that it is, let's say this is a nerve cell and this is acetylcholine. What happens, it's a messenger that goes from the end of one cell to the beginning of another cell and sends a message. As you'll see, one of the functions of acetylcholine is facilitating memory. So when you're thinking about nutrition, do I want my diet to have enough choline in it to make sure my memory is optimal? The same kind of concept can be applied to pregnancy and development. So choline is very interesting for more reasons than just acetylcholine, but I just kind of wanted to remind you of that. So of interest is choline is transferred across the placenta, which shows that it's an important piece across the placenta from maternal circulation to the fetus, which shows it's an important component in development. So a little more about choline. So I have this slide, and then the next slide I have food sources. So as I mentioned before, I give the DRIs for nutrients that are critical here. But let's take a moment to talk about what choline does. So one is, besides, we mentioned acetylcholine already as the example because I thought you might remember it. Remember what a phospholipid is? Somebody tell me.
It's in cell membranes. It has a polar head and non-polar tail.
Beautiful. It's a component of cell membranes, right? Phospholipids are what makes up the bulk of our cell membranes. So choline is there in our cell membranes. So it's part of cell membrane structure and involved in communication from one cell to the next. Another thing that it does, and this is also critical, remember the word methyl? We talked about methyl groups last time. Do you remember what a methyl group is?
CH3.
Thank you. And we talked about it with respect to folate. And we said, well, folic acid, one of the major functions of folic acid is it transfers carbon groups like methyl groups from one molecule to another, and that's critically important. Okay, so choline also has, like folic acid, a very similar function. So it is a methyl donor, and it assists with the closure of the notochord. Remember us talking about that last time, how there's a short period of time that for which folic acid is required for the notochord to close so that the spinal column can grow appropriately. Well, choline is also important in that process. Okay, so it's one of these like hider components that we need to learn more about. So we talked about it being synthesis of acetylcholine, and here's what's interesting about the scientific literature shows that dietary choline and maternal choline status may affect memory and learning for her offspring. There's certainly animal studies like mouse and rat studies that show this, and some indication in human studies. So another reason why making sure we have enough choline for our own selves, but also for the whole pregnancy issue. Now, what's interesting is maternal intake is usually low. Most people consume less than the AI, and it is found in some prenatal supplements, not all of them, but it's becoming more of a well-known component than it has been. So here's your food sources of choline. And sorry, I hope you don't mind pictures. I think they help us look at slides. It's not just words, right? So, so let's go back here. So choline for not pregnant and pregnant, those numbers are pretty close, 425 milligrams. So how easy is it to get choline from food? Well, this, what I find fun is that a lot of tables of nutrients start out with an egg or have an egg in it, because eggs have lots of nutrients. They're inexpensive for people, so they don't remind me of so much elite advice. You can get eggs for not very much money. They're high sources of proteins, and they've got other things besides choline. They've got vitamin B12 and so on. So they're a good source for people. But so they're high in choline. This, you may or may not appreciate this kind of example. I can usually gauge this better in person, but if you remember in food science, when you add certain components, let's say you're making something with a mixture, a baking mixture. Let's say you're making a cake. Okay, so you add, it's got flour, sugar, salt, and an egg. The purpose of the egg is to emulsify the fat into the rest of the batter, which is the same thing that bile does in the body, right? So it's an emulsifier. So in eggs, this is just a fun fact. Eggs have lots of choline in the form of something called lecithin. That's an emulsifier. So it just happens to have a lot. It makes it fun to cook with, and also very helpful for a good source of choline. So here's some other sources. So you can see if you eat these types of foods, then you can add up to a good choline intake. What is interesting is this is not added to fortified foods. So if someone is eating a traditional American diet, and I don't mean to disparage it or call it traditional, but the usual American diet that is high in processed foods, hamburgers, pizza, all this kind of stuff, choline intake is going to be low. So choline is important. Okay, so the next nutrient is that I'm going to talk about is omega-3 fatty acids. Take a breather here. I know you have talked about this in other classes. I know in our introductory course, we talk about omega-3 fats. It's probably been 2 years since you had that course. I know we also talk about fatty acid metabolism in our nutrition and physiology class, but I often use this class to kind of remind you what these fats are. And then if you follow through and take biochemical nutrition, then you'll also get a repeat of this. But I want to take a moment here. I'll talk a little bit more in depth in the pregnancy lecture, because while some of these nutrients are important prior to pregnancy and they're all important during pregnancy, some really become critical during pregnancy. So I'll emphasize those a little more. So the omega-3 fats come in three basic molecules that you're going to be familiar with, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. But what I have here is alpha, the adequate intake for alpha linolenic acid. The abbreviation is ALA. On the next slide, I have a repeat of this. And this is how much is recommended for not pregnant, which would be prior to pregnancy, pregnant, and then lactation. Okay, so it's an essential nutrient. Now, I'm going to tell you more about this because I want to make sure you know the difference between ALA, which is actually not found in fish, and the longer chain omega-3 fatty acids that are. So stay with me on this. Okay, so what are omega-3 fats? Just to give you, this is going back over this to make sure you understand. There are 3 primary molecules that you're going to see on food labels and in tables. The first one, which I just talked about, is alpha-linolenic acid. And this one is required for pregnancy. This is, now look at this, alpha-linolenic acid versus a longer chain icosapentaenoic acid, and then an even longer chain fatty acid called docosahexaenoic acid. Now, how you can tell the length, this right here, and I think you learned this in chemistry, but you may forget about it, but this right here is a formula for a fatty acid. And this 18 means this one is 18 carbons in length. I'll give you a moment to write that down. The 18 is 18 carbons in length. And the 3 is the don't get this wrong, is the number of double bonds in this fatty acid. Not that it's an omega-3, but it's the number of double bonds in this long chain fatty acid. So this is a short chain fatty acid. We can get it from diet. Here's flaxseed, canola oil, soybean oil. We don't get much, but we sure get some, okay? So this is one way to get alpha-linolenic acid. And so sometimes, depending on, flaxseed oil is not something people often eat unless they buy it as a supplement. You can't cook with it, but you can stir it up in oatmeal and things like this. These are cooking oils. This is sort of something you might sprinkle on something. So you can get omega-3 fatty acids from these sources. So that's good to know. Now, but hang on to that, because it's not necessarily good enough for prior to pregnancy or pregnancy. Okay, so the longer chain essential fatty acid is icosapentaenoic acid. Okay, and this particular one is found in fish and supplements. So how does it get here? Well, it gets in supplements because we put it in there, but fish have this longer chain essential fatty acid in the omega-3 group because they consume algae and things like that that have this shorter chain, and they actually produce longer chains. So fish have omega-3 fats, EPA and DHA, that are longer and have more double bonds. And these are the ones that are really, really important prior to pregnancy and during pregnancy. It's the long chain ones. So I'm going to go into more detail on this in pregnancy, not very long from now. But what I will tell you is I'm personally a pro-vegetarian lifestyle person in terms of all the so many reasons, but I started adding fish to my diet, and I think I told you all that one of the first or second day of class, because I believe our diets are inadequate in general if we don't get these long chain omega-3 fats, and they're hard to get. Now, your question might be, well, how about I just eat this, and can our body make these long chain fatty acids out of ALA? The answer is yes, but we're not good at it. That means, this is something you should be writing down, only about 9% of ALA is converted by the human body to EPA and DHA.
I have a question. It's more like curiosity, so if this is kind of off topic, I can email you about it too. But so I don't eat fish, and I haven't in a couple years either, and I realize how important omega-3s are, So I started doing research to see if I could take some sort of supplement, because I don't like taking supplements. I like getting, you know, the nutrients I need from my food, but when it comes to omega-3, just like you said, the ALA conversion rate is just so low. I was like, okay, well, I'm okay with taking one supplement. So I started doing research, and that's when I learned that fish get the omega-3s from algae.
Mm-hmm.
So I found a supplement that, you know, is third-party tested, and it seems like it's higher quality. I'm just curious why we go through like the middleman of like feeding fish omega-3s and then farming them and using their oil instead of just using the microalgae, since it's more environmentally sustainable. Like if people are going to buy a fish oil supplement, why don't we just promote like an algae supplement, since it's less
Okay.
steps in the manufacturing process?
So I love your question. There's many pieces, and I'd like to unpack it right here. Okay, so the next couple of slides, I have fish sources of omega-3 fats, and also pros and cons, because there's mercury and things like that, right? So so if you guys don't mind, let me just wax on this for a minute. So before we had modern agriculture, where we grew cattle and stopped feeding them grass and let them, and stopped letting them eat grass, and instead force fed them, or gave them, you know, not force feeding, but gave them corn and soybeans and other products. Before we started doing that, animals naturally, wild animals naturally ate weeds and things in our environment. Their fat and their tissues were a lot lower in saturated fat and much higher in omega-3 fats. So we were actually, an earlier diet was a lot more functional in the United States traditional diet, right? So that's one thing that's happened. Another thing that's happened is, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is that I think part of our evolution involved eating long chain fatty acids, which helped us become like really smart organisms. So there's that, and those are probably associated with fish consumption. Just bringing that background up, okay? So things have changed a lot. Our modern food supply has, you know, it's not good, right? We have very few omega-3s, a lot of omega-6s, and a lot of saturated fat, right? And so back to your issue, why don't we just take algae, right? Or let me get at this, okay? So if we eat fish in the wild that are low mercury fish, which is hard to get, but wild salmon, for example, then we can get a good amount of EPA and DHA. If you don't want to eat fish, and how else can we get omega-3s? Well, we can get them from eggs. Notice I have eggs here. The way the eggs happen is we feed the algae to the chickens. So then the chickens incorporate the longer chain omega-3 fats, and that gets into the eggs. Baby foods, they take the algae and use that as a source for the longer chain amino acids, fatty acids. And so those are workarounds that we have. So those are ways to get these things. The algae is not a bad idea, but I think what you were saying is, you're asking about farming. Why don't we just ask your question again? I try to get around it, is do we farm? Yeah, just ask it again, Stephanie. Sorry.
Yeah, so I was just basically wondering, again, just curious, if someone's going to take a fish supplement, like if they don't want to eat actual fish, then I guess I'm just asking why aren't algae supplements more popular or more like used?
I think they're fine, but I can let me. This gets really complicated too. I've been to a lot of conferences where they talk about DHA and EPA and, you know, oils and how they've tried to change them and genetically modify them and do all this kind of stuff. And it gets down to, what is the exact ratio of EPA and DHA do we need for maximum health, right? And then that question is not completely understood. So that's one issue. We're not sure that's right. And here's where I'm really getting at this is, the studies that have looked at maternal outcomes show that moms or pregnant women that consume fish, that translates to, even with issues with fish, into higher cognitive function with kids and their kids. And so we have those studies. That's eating fish. The studies that look at supplements instead aren't as robust. And that's part of the issue. that's part of it. The other issue is we have industry lobbies in the United States that promote agribusiness, and in this case, it would be fisheries. So it's complicated by that. But my personal opinion is, based on reading about this for years, is that there's some benefit of eating the fish. Having said that, there's not enough fish on the planet to sustain our 9 billion and counting people. So a good solution to eat something like flaxseed oil or algae, as a supplement is probably a good idea. I hope you guys are okay with this kind of lengthy explanation. Sometimes these questions make the whole conversation a little more relevant. So give me some feedback about it at some point. I promised a survey. I'll go ahead and do that. Do you have any more questions? I'm not sure that I really answered it. What I really said is nothing's perfect. Nothing is perfect. We can't all eat fish. There's not enough fish. If we try to eat fish, some of the fish is too high in mercury. So then we have a problem there. And then not everybody can afford fish, right? And so then also, overfishing is bad for the planet. So then what do we do? Well, then we can look at algae as a supplement. And is that a good idea? Well, it may be better than nothing. Is it as good as fish? Probably not. Is there a good answer? Not right now.
Well, is it, because I know you kind of mentioned this, but is it because we don't make the long
Yeah.
as well? So, yeah.
But the algae, okay. The algae that Stephanie was talking about, there's one plant source that produces DHA. It's an algae, but I should have had it on here, except that, it's used to fortify kids' products, but the literature on fish is stronger than the literature on just getting these algae supplements. If someone is a dyed in the wool, I don't want to eat animal products, then sure, go for a supplement that's made from algae. But the studies that show the benefits of consuming fish are stronger than the ones that look at supplements. Anybody else? This is complicated, but it's very interesting and relevant to so many things. It's relevant to our dietary choices, lifestyle, the planet, health of, giving advice to other people. So if there's any other questions, let me know. And if you guys, maybe I should start a discussion thread or something if you care about talking about it, but maybe I'll try that and see if it works. But we okay? All right. Omega-3 fats are just so interesting. It's one of the most interesting categories of nutrients there are. Okay, so I have this on the slide. Only about 9% is consumed of ALA is consumed as converted to DHA, and most women do not consume enough omega-3 fats. I'm going to go out on a limb, which I've done before, and say that in the United States, not enough people consume omega-3 fats. I actually think we have an intelligence issue, not just from, lead in the water and pesticides and contaminants and stuff that people are exposed to, but I think omega-3 fats are critical for cognitive function. So I think it's a big deal. Okay, so what are you supposed to do, right? Listen to all the stories I tell you, and our conversation is complicated, right? But this is an FDA, stupid thing. This is an FDA handout that is the most current recommendations. What are you supposed to do? And this would be the advice that you would give anyone that you were advising about diet prior to pregnancy and during pregnancy. And this is pretty good. So let's look and see what it says. For women of childbearing age, that's why this is in this lecture. And then especially pregnant and breastfeeding women, and for parents of caregivers of young children. This is the advice that takes into consideration the fact that fish is good for you. We need omega-3 fats, and fish can also be high in mercury, which permanently affects brain development, and it's terrible. Okay, so on the one hand, fish can be your savior. On the other hand, it can be to your detriment. Okay, so what are the recommendations? Eat 2 to 3 servings of fish a week from this best choices, or 1 from the good choices list. eat a variety, serve 1 to 2 servings of fish a week to children around age 2. You can start earlier. And this is such a big deal, you guys. If you eat fish caught by family or friends, look to see where they caught the fish. And I can spend an hour and a half on this topic, and I just can't afford it in this class. But the reason that we talk about this is that, and I'll have resources for you on our website, on our Canvas site, but some bodies of water have contaminants in them and fish pick them up. They can either be mercury contaminants, which is pretty common, or they can also have some other contaminants, you know, polychlorinated biphenyls and stuff like that. So we can't just eat fish willy-nilly. We need to know where it came from. I will show you how to research that. I have actually, one of our resources is a link to bodies of water in Texas. Are the fish safe? Because this is such a big deal. This is a general chart for everyone in the United States. And so what they say is, you know, eat 2 to 3 servings. This is a pretty good, safe list. So 2 servings, and we're looking at 4 ounces for adults. And then these are good choices, which have a little more mercury. And so I wouldn't necessarily be as giddy with them about calling it good. But prior to pregnancy and during pregnancy and for children, all this stuff is off the table. Okay, these guys, and I'm going to show you in the next couple of slides why. These are all high mercury. So here's a slide that shows you the fish. And you guys, I won't ask you these numbers. You know I won't. I'm just trying to show you why we care. So here's mercury, which is a neurotoxin. Here's the fish, and then here's how much omega-3s, and these are the long chain omega-3 fats, that both DHA and EPA. Look how good salmon is. You know, farmed salmon or Atlantic salmon, which is often farmed salmon, is if people can afford it, and it's elite advice sometimes, but look how good. It's a nice source of omega-3 fats. Anchovies, if people will eat small fish, it's pretty good too. Look at that. Mackerel, not king mackerel, this is other mackerels. And then we start to worry about some of these high mercury products. So these are in order of, this whole list is in order of omega-3 fats. And then this shows you which of the ones you probably don't want to do. So tuna, albacore tuna, and then tuna, skipjack, and yellowfin. These are high in mercury. I say don't eat them. Avoid them. So if you're used to making tuna salad, and albacore tuna is more fun to prepare because it's got a nicer texture, just get over it, right? And so then what you want to do is go for the chunk light tuna. Look at the bottom here, canned. This is usually, you know, star-kissed or whatever, chunk light tuna, and compare the amount of mercury in a serving. So it's really lower.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Oh, did someone else as well? Or am I just hearing
Yeah,
myself?
I had a quick question.
Oh, you can go first.
Are they required to put mercury levels on cans?
Okay. Thank you for asking that question. No, and here's why. Okay, this is it's such a good question, you guys. This is such important consumer information, but our government is, we've talked about this, as a pro-consumer, not pro-consumer, pro-industry policies. The people that grow fish, manufacture fish, make money off selling fish have high interest lobbies, and they buy their politicians, and they give lots of monies to get people elected that would never allow some kind of legislation like this that would decrease consumption. And I know this for a fact because several years ago, some articles came out about mercury in fish, and those became highly unpopular because of the fish industry. So no, they're never going to tell you this stuff. You know, I will say that'll never happen because it would decrease sales. Stephanie?
Yes, thank you. So I'm wondering if it's true, very generalized, and from the perspective of just like thinking about it in easier terms, that since mercury, I know, like, builds up in fish and their body can't process it out, if you're eating like smaller fish and fish that is maybe doesn't have a long of a life. So like for the reason we don't eat sharks is because they eat other fish and they accumulate mercury. Is that in general true?
All across the board, yeah. And that across the board. So actually, like I said, usually in class I go through the fish advisories and talk about this more. But the longer the fish, the more mercury. So like king mackerel, if you got a baby and ate it, which is going to have like 2 ounces of fish, right? But if you catch larger fish, the larger they are, the predators, the higher up they are on the food chain, the more likely they are to have more mercury. Absolutely. And again, I usually put all this together in this lecture instead of splitting it between the pre-pregnancy and post-pregnancy. So thank you for bringing that up. So this advice is for, these are smaller fish and they're not apex predators. That's the deal. These are apex predators and they're big. All right. Now, sadly, I bring this up because a lot of people like sushi, and much of the sushi that if you love sushi, the sushi, you know how you spend like $18 for a bite of something. Remember when you used to go to restaurants and stuff? A lot of the tuna is this big eye or skipjack or yellowfin tuna, bluefin. It's fine if you have a bite, but if you're eating 3 ounces on a regular basis, then you could be consuming too much mercury. This will not only affect development, but also affect your own health. Okay, so we don't want high intake of mercury. Okay, so I will go over this later in the pregnancy lecture. We'll come back to this. I didn't prepare for this today, but we'll come back to this and I'll show you about how to tell if the fish you catch is safe or not. And then this gives you an idea. These are all the super high mercury fish, right? Where they're apex predators. And king mackerel is an interesting one, where if it's shorter, it's okay, but once it's like 35 inches, all bets are off, and then it's really scary. So, okay, so that's just to make sure that we understand that if you're going to eat fish and you can afford it, eating fish is a good idea. If you can't afford it, then supplements are better than nothing. Here's what a prenatal vitamin supplement just looks like. They're not exactly the same, but most of them are kind of like this. And you can see some of the nutrients we've already talked about can be in these prenatals. So for example, choline is popped in there now. Folic acid's a big one. We've talked about iron, we've talked about DHA, we've talked about iodine. So many of the nutrients we've already talked about are in these vitamin supplements. And for pregnancy, I'm pro supplement. I don't think of any harm for doing this, and it may fill in gaps if diet's not ideal. Okay, just to let you know. So other practices in pregnancy. What about coffee? Prior to pregnancy, sorry, I'm still prior to. Remember, we're gonna be a little redundant with the pregnancy lecture because it's different if you're prior to preparing for pregnancy or pregnancy.
So question on the last slide on what's in red. What do we need to know?
What's what?
What's in red? Like, what does the red mean, and what do we need to know on this slide?
The red are just high energy, high interest, mostly interesting nutrients that we often don't consume enough of. But I'm not going to ask you prenatal. I'm not going to ask you. Here's what I would ask if I wanted a question on this. I don't, you guys, this is way too much detail, but if I don't give it to you, then you don't have any idea what's on prenatal supplements. It's a good question. So what I might say is, which of the following nutrients is not typically in a prenatal vitamin supplement, right? And so it might be something like copper, you know, that's not on here. So we will be talking about this so much, you'll be comfortable with these nutrients. And so I'd pick something just kind of off the beaten path. But I just want you to have an idea. Actually, this is a feel-good slide to make sure you understand that if people can get enough healthcare to take prenatals, they're probably going to meet these issues, many of the issues that we've been talking about. And I've had friends, you know, in academia, I'm lucky to have young friends, you know, people that are 20, 30 years younger than I am, and students and so forth. So I know a lot of people are going through pregnancy or recently gone through pregnancy, and a lot of them come to me and ask for questions about this and ask what to do. And they'll say, I don't eat fish. I say, take a prenatal vitamin supplement and calm down. If you won't eat fish, just calm down and take it, because that covers your bases, right? That'll work for almost anybody unless someone is adamant about not consuming any animal products. And there's going to be sources of DHA that you can get, like the algae that Stephanie was talking about, for people to handle that. But this gets into just a lot of complicated conversations, right? We can cover so much here, and then we got to kind of move on. So here's a fun one. Coffee. Here's what I have to say about coffee. And I wish you guys were in class with me, but so coffee is an ubiquitous beverage, which we may lose due to global warming, but I won't go there. But it is consumed by so many people, and so many researchers who studied coffee, because they can only do the research because they're dependent on the caffeine from drinking coffee. You know, so it's a circuitous. They've all studied, is coffee going to give me cancer, pancreatic cancer, colon cancer? How bad is the coffee? So it's really well studied. And most, you know, I've been looking at this for a long time. I've actually done 4 research projects on athletics and caffeine. So I have some past history of looking at it. And I don't do that research now, but, you know, it just seems like most of the studies are, you know, calm down. If you don't overconsume, it's fine. It's not a poison. It may seem like it because it's a legal drug that feels good and doesn't hurt you. It seems to be okay, right? So let's, you know, don't start, because I mean, I'm not trying to start a habit with you. I'm just saying, okay, coffee's okay. However, there is some indication that people that have difficulty with fertility, that coffee may be, and maybe it's the caffeine, but the caffeine or caffeine containing products or coffee may be of concern for fertility. For example, if a woman has had fertility issues and had a couple of miscarriages, I would leave coffee off the table. Fertility specialists will say that as well. But if someone's living their normal life and they haven't had this kind of experience, if they're drinking, you know, 200 milligrams of coffee is not that, is low. And it's like a cup of brewed coffee, you guys. And look, this is 8 ounces. And so this is the olden days when I was a kid. This is what coffee was like, and probably didn't even have this much caffeine in it, because because we didn't double whammy the coffee like Starbucks does. So in today's world, you know, this is an 8-ounce coffee. You go to Starbucks, you're going to get 16 ounce, and it may have would you like an extra shot with that? How many times have you been asked that if you're a coffee drinker? So your intake can be really high without even thinking about it. So if that's the case, that's a bad habit, right? Other bad Starbucks habits involve those like Frappuccino drinks and stuff. They're drinking sugar calories, but that's for another story. So the bottom line here is moderate intake is probably fine.
I had a question about a question I got, which was, does caffeine have an effect on bone density for older women that have issues?
I don't think caffeine's important on that. If you wouldn't mind sending me an email, then I'll make sure when I cover older adults, I'll get to that. Sodas have had a negative impact, but it may be the phosphoric acid and not the caffeine. But if you don't mind, write me that and I'll make sure I do a good lit review so I can get to you with a good answer to that. So I love questions like that. Okay, so this is probably obvious to everybody, but we still have to talk about it. Alcohol, you know, it's anybody that's watched Game of Thrones or lived in the United States, has seen, alcohol, or watched any ads on TV or anything, realizes that alcohol is part of the fabric of our country. Pros and cons. You know, a lot of people don't consume alcohol. Some people consume it, with rare frequency. Some people consume it a lot. Graduate school is a time where people can start drinking too much. Times of stress. Let's don't even talk about COVID with that. But so it's a norm in our society, yet it is a developmental neurotoxin. So, and look at this, 50% of women have consumed alcohol during the 3 months prior to pregnancy. So it's very common. And not to be sarcastic, but if people are drinking a lot, then their judgment may not be that great, and they may end up getting pregnant because of the activity of drinking too much alcohol. Does that make sense? Right? So you have to be careful. People need to be careful. Oh my goodness. Okay. So, more common among women that are older than 35 years and white, but we have to think about that. So alcohol consumption's common. It's a known teratogen. Do y'all remember what teratogen means?
Causing
Birth defect causing.
That's right. Something that causes a birth defect. Alcohol is a known teratogen. Now, you may ask, well, you know, how much? Is there a safe limit? And I'll talk about this a little more with pregnancy, but no. What I am convinced by the literature that we know it's a teratogen, but what we don't know is there a safe limit? If there is such a safe limit, when is it? Can I be sure if I drink alcohol that it won't affect the fetus? We don't know that. So prior to pregnancy, it can absolutely interfere with, it's a fertility issue, stillbirth, preterm birth, and miscarriage. So heavy alcohol consumption is a teratogen and also has a lot of other effects prior to pregnancy. During pregnancy, we'll talk about it, but there's serious birth defects associated with it. So what I will say is parenting and alcohol, this is not the time to marry the two of those. It's a time to not focus your life on alcohol because it's not going to work. For one thing, you can't take care of kids in that way. So I don't mean to be moralistic. I'm just saying we're growing new humans. Their brains depend on our consumption and our habits. And so if we engage in habits that we know can cause birth defects, then shouldn't maybe be having kids. We should wait and do that. We're in that mode. You know, pot is also teratogenic, but the literature on this there's not that much. We have literature on alcohol because people drink and it's legal, but pot has only recently been legal in a few states. And you think about trying to do a study. Do you want to know, does smoking pot prior to pregnancy affect stillbirth, right? Or affect fertility? To do those kinds of studies, man, you've got to jump through some hoops that may be impossible